Now, sometimes when we're doing analysis, we have a limited amount of information, or in certain extreme situations, we may have too much information. We need to decide as we're preparing for and as we're doing financial analysis, are we going to look at a single period, or perhaps that's all the information we have? Will that give us enough information? Will we know the questions to ask? Because it's very important to remember that specifically with ratios and generally with financial analysis, its goal is to show questions we need to ask rather than answering questions. It's really designed to show us, to indicate areas of concern, not panic, but concern. So the more information we have, the better, up to a point. The banker's rule of thumb when it comes to financial analysis, and I mentioned this earlier, is 3 to 5 consecutive years of financials. And some of you may be asking why. In my experience, it really has to do with reliability of the numbers. Unless you have a minimum of 3 consecutive periods, you can't know if there's any trend. If you have more than 5 years, is some of the older data too old to be relevant to today's and the future circumstances? I did a project with Mattel a number of years ago in which they presented 9 consecutive year ends. Well, what happened 7, 8, 9 years ago in their business has absolutely no relationship to what's happening today or in the future. So it was nice to see the numbers, and it was impressive to have that much data, but did not add any real value to the analysis. So it's important to remember too much data can be more noise than value. Not enough data, we have no way to make a decision. So we're looking for that window in between, 3 to 5 years generally. And another quick caveat, when we're talking about financial analysis, we want year ends or end of period numbers. And the specific reason, and we mentioned this very briefly back when we were going over the financial statements, is that interim numbers, 9-month numbers, are never going to be consistent with year ends. Why? Because there are certain accounting adjustments we make at the end of an accounting period, at the end of a year, that we will not see in any of the interim numbers. So if you've got a year end for the last 3 years and then 9 months or 7 months for the current period, those numbers are not comparable. This is why during my banking days, we would never make a loan decision based on interim numbers. We'd look at the year ends. If we were close enough to the subsequent year end, we'd wait for that. If not, we would completely ignore the current interim for the reasons we just said. Very important. One of the biggest decisions every organization that produces products has to make, and equally when we're analyzing an organization, one of the most telling points is the make versus buy decision. Now we have the formulas here. The formulas are pretty straightforward, and we provided you an Excel model to calculate the make versus buy decision on a financial basis. And the financial calculation is pretty straightforward. It'll tell us from a mathematical standpoint, is it more economical, more financially reasonable for us to make this particular item or to outsource it? That's from the financial standpoint. But it's very important to remember the non-financial ingredients here, which a lot of people forget. A couple of years ago, I addressed the Institute for Supply Management's national conference, and the subject was insourcing or reshoring or backshoring. There's a number of different terms used for it. And a lot of it had to do with the make versus buy decision of, at that time, US companies. And through my research, I was able to actually list 37 different reasons beyond the financial calculation why you might want to make a product rather than outsource it. If you do the calculations on make versus buy using these two simple formulas, you'll come up with a clear financial decision. If those differences are small, then the non-financial reasons, such as quality, shortening lead time, reducing the shipping costs, improving your own cash flow, protecting intellectual property, faster problem solving, better reaction time when there's issues, etc., all come into play. All of these are important. The 37 different reasons why you might want to make something instead of outsource it can all be taken into consideration in your analysis. The closer the price difference is between make and buy, the more you may want to consider these. If in reality, the difference to outsource is dramatic compared to making it yourself, and you can control lead time, quality, intellectual property, etc., then you definitely want to outsource. If, on the other hand, you're concerned about losing your intellectual property, your secret sauce, your actual unique properties, then perhaps the short-term financial benefit of outsourcing is not there. And I bring these up because make versus buy is not as straightforward as many people think. The mathematical calculations are the simple part. The non-financial elements are the more challenging piece. Now let's reverse this. Let's look at Altman Z-score. Now, if you're doing analysis of any organization, you have a tool that is not new, but it is the best in the world. It's the most consistent. And I'll share with you the fact that Edward Altman originally developed this back in 1969, published it, I believe, in the Journal of Applied Economics back in 72. So we're talking such a long time ago. Why on earth would we be using this score, this tool? And the answer is, this has been challenged and tested hundreds, if not thousands of times against other models. There is not another model in the world that is as accurate or as consistent. It's quite amazing. Altman created, after analyzing thousands of organizations, a relatively simple mathematical formula. And again, we've got the Excel model in the tools that we've provided for you. Originally, the Altman Z-score was designed for publicly traded manufacturing companies. Subsequently, Altman created two additional models with slight variations, one for non-public companies and a separate one, the third one, for non-manufacturing companies. And those are slight variations of these and also available. The concept is, all we need is to calculate 5 simple ratios, apply the specific weights that are listed here, and that's absolutely critical, to come up with a score. If the Z-score is 3 or above, the company is probably very strong. We have no concern about them defaulting financially. If their score is 1.8 or below, there's a very high probability that they will default on their financial obligations in the next 18 months. This has been used, like I said, many, many, many times, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of times. It's about 95% accurate, which is a phenomenal record for such a tool. And if you look at the ratios we're calculating, the denominator on 4 of the 5 is total assets. What do we have invested in the organization? And if you look at the weights, the relationship of operating profit to total assets, what are we generating from our assets, is about 3.5 times more important than the relationship of sales to assets. And it's over 5 times more important than the relationship of equity to liabilities. So the weights and the specific ratios are critical. Very easy to look at the financial statements and calculate those 5 ratios. It's very simple to apply those weights. You come up with a result, and as we show on the spreadsheet here, in this case, this organization has a 3.933 Z-score. Very solid financially. We don't have to worry, based on their numbers, about them defaulting on their obligations. We still do all the rest of the analysis, but we don't have to worry. On the other hand, if we'd gone through here and calculated the Z-score at something 1.9, 2.3, we would be much more concerned. And we would then have to dive into the organization to try to determine what is the cause. What are they doing that should cause us concern? So as you can see, it's a relatively straightforward, surprisingly simple, amazingly accurate tool that everyone who's doing any financial analysis should certainly use. When we're looking at an organization that produces a product, we need to be aware of and take a look at how they're calculating the value of their inventory. There are 4 standard methods, and depending on what country they're housed in and what accounting standard they're using, IFRS versus GAAP versus a local or a regional method, first in, first out, or FIFO, is the most traditional approach. It's pretty straightforward. The first item you buy is the first item you sell. The first item you create is the first item that you put out the door. Many organizations do that. If you walk into a convenience store, you're thirsty, you go over to the refrigerator cabinet, you open up the door, you take out a bottle of juice, the next one slides down. That's first in, first out. Probably the most common way to look at inventory. Last in, first out is just the opposite. The last piece of material we buy is the first one we sell. Seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? In fact, in many situations, IFRS does not allow us to use last in, first out as an evaluation method for our inventory. Why do organizations use last in, first out? In most situations, if an organization is using LIFO inventory methods, it's an indication that they're operating in a high inflation economy. If the inflation in their country or where their customers are or the suppliers are has high inflation, costs are going up rapidly. The organization wants to try to match their current selling price with their current costs. So last in, first out is a very common method in those situations. We just need to be careful that if an organization does that, there is a reserve that is held called a LIFO reserve that will try to bridge the accounting gap at some point in the future when accounting begins to slow down. The old items that we bought a long time ago we haven't used yet have a very, very low cost. When we put those into production and sell those, we're going to have what looks to be a giant profit. Current selling price is very high. Our original cost was very low, unusually high profit margin. In most cases, it won't actually be that high because other operating costs have increased over time. That's where the LIFO reserve comes in to balance that. If the price of our material varies throughout the year, such as with commodities, cotton, gold, coal, etc., we might use a weighted average. How many units in each period did we buy at what price? And come up with a weighted average for the year as a more accurate measure. When we have very valuable individual pieces of inventory, such as automobiles, Car dealers don't use FIFO, LIFO, or weighted average. Their lenders would not accept that. If you're an automobile dealer, if you're a fine jewelry dealer, and each piece of inventory you have can be individually identified by a serial number and has significant value, you're not going to use the other methods. You're going to have a list of the inventory you buy, and the specific item that you sell is identified against its exact cost, that specific identification. So when you're doing financial analysis, when you're looking at an organization that has inventory, inventory is a material component of the overall organization. You want to be very careful to understand which inventory method they're using, because their inventory value on the balance sheet and cost on the income statement can be dramatically different depending on which method they're using. If you understand the method, you can follow to make sure that the balance sheet and the income statement entries are correct.